The Billionaire's Scheme. Ethan Blackstone was a man of perfection. Every aspect of his life, from his sprawling penthouse overlooking the bustling city to the intricately detailed blueprints of his multimillion-dollar ventures, bore the mark of his relentless pursuit of excellence. To the outside world, he was the epitome of success, a self-made billionaire whose calculated precision turned everything he touched into gold. But beneath his polished exterior, Ethan harbored a simmering bitterness, a festering wound left by betrayal. Vanessa Carter, his former fiancée, had been more than just a partner. She was his equal in ambition, a reflection of the life Ethan had meticulously constructed. Their relationship had been a merger of power and elegance, celebrated by the tabloids and envied by socialites. But everything shattered one fateful night. Returning from a business trip earlier than expected, Ethan stepped into the penthouse to find laughter. Familiar, but wrong. He followed the sound to his private lounge, where Vanessa was entwined with another man. Not just any man, but Lucas Grayson, a rival whose name surfaced often in boardroom whispers and headlines. Vanessa's reaction wasn't one of guilt or remorse. It was irritation. Her flippant dismissal of his presence, as though he were the intruder, was the ultimate insult. For days after, Ethan spiraled. He buried himself in work, ignoring the growing whispers about his canceled engagement. The humiliation burned deeper than he cared to admit. Vanessa's betrayal wasn't just personal, it was public. His name, synonymous with power, now bore the stain of infidelity. It was during one of these sleepless nights, staring at the city skyline, that the idea struck. If Vanessa's betrayal was a deliberate play for dominance, Ethan's retaliation would be equally calculated. He would marry, but not for love. His bride would be the antithesis of Vanessa, a woman so far removed from the polished, ambitious circles Vanessa thrived in that the contrast alone would send shockwaves through their world. And he knew exactly who that woman would be. Grace Everly lived a life of quiet simplicity. Working as a cleaner in one of Ethan's downtown offices, she blended into the background like wallpaper. Her life revolved around practicality, her dreams boxed away years ago by the weight of responsibility. Grace had grown up in a working-class family, where resilience wasn't just a virtue but a necessity. Her parents had passed away when she was young, leaving her to care for her younger brother, Owen. Each day was a battle to make ends meet. Cleaning offices wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, honest work. And it allowed Grace to keep Owen in school, far away from the streets that had claimed so many of his friends. She avoided entanglements, preferring the safety of anonymity. But that would all change with one conversation. Ethan observed Grace for weeks before making his move. She wasn't remarkable in the conventional sense, but there was a quiet dignity about her, a sense of integrity that couldn't be feigned. When he finally approached her, the proposal he laid out sounded absurd even to his own ears. "I want you to marry me," he said, leaning against the desk in her modest cleaning closet turned rake room. Grace blinked at him, her hand pausing midair with a coffee cup. "Excuse me." "I'm serious," Ethan replied, his voice as steady as his gaze. "It's a mutually beneficial arrangement. You'll have financial stability, and I'll achieve a personal goal." Grace tilted her head, studying him. "You're a billionaire. You can have any woman you want. Why me?" "Because you're not like them," he said simply. "You're honest, grounded. Everything Vanessa isn't." At the mention of Vanessa, Grace narrowed her eyes. The name rang a bell. She'd seen the headlines about the glamorous heiress and the billionaire's broken engagement. It didn't take a genius to connect the dots. So this is revenge. Ethan didn't flinch, in part. But it's more than that. I need someone who won't manipulate or betray me, someone who can help me send a message. Grace chuckled, shaking her head. "This is insane." "I'll pay off your debts," Ethan pressed. "Ensure your brother's education is fully funded. You'll have access to resources that can change your life." The mention of Owen made her pause. She thought of the late notices piling up on her kitchen counter, the nights she spent poring over bills by candlelight because the electricity had been shut off again. Still, the idea of marrying a stranger, especially one as cold and calculating as Ethan Blackstone, felt like stepping into a lion's den. "I'd be giving up my freedom," she pointed out. "You'd be gaining security," he countered. "And this wouldn't be permanent, just long enough to serve its purpose." Grace stared at him, her mind racing. The offer was outrageous, but it dangled the kind of stability she'd never dared to dream of. Yet it came at a cost. Ethan's world was a gilded cage, and she wasn't sure she wanted to step inside. Ethan left the decision in her hands, but he didn't have to wait long. 3 days later, Grace showed up at his office, her expression a mix of determination and resignation. "I'll do it," she said, "but on one condition. I won't be a puppet. If I'm stepping into your world, I do it as myself. Take it or leave it." Ethan nodded, a flicker of admiration crossing his face. "Deal." The announcement of their engagement sent shockwaves through the media. The story of the billionaire marrying a humble maid became a feeding frenzy for tabloids, with headlines ranging from mocking to speculative. Grace, overwhelmed by the sudden spotlight, found herself thrust into a world of designer gowns and intrusive cameras. Ethan, ever the strategist, played his role flawlessly, presenting a united front that masked the chaos simmering beneath the surface. But for all his control, Ethan hadn't anticipated one thing: Grace's refusal to conform. She didn't care about socialite approval or corporate alliances. Her authenticity was a stark contrast to the calculated performances around her, and it began to disrupt the rhythm of Ethan's meticulously curated life. As the wedding day approached, Ethan's plans seemed to be falling into place, yet a nagging feeling he couldn't identify began to take root. Grace wasn't just playing a part in his game of revenge. She was becoming something far more dangerous, a mirror to his own humanity. And humanity was something Ethan Blackstone had long since buried. Shadows of the past. The wedding was a spectacle. Media outlets buzzed with every detail, from Grace's understated gown, an elegant yet simple design Ethan insisted she wear, to the guest list brimming with billionaires, celebrities, and influencers. For Ethan, the event was more than a marriage. It was a declaration of power. He wanted Vanessa to see what she had lost, and who had replaced her. For Grace, the wedding felt surreal. The murmurs of disbelief as she walked down the aisle, the flashing cameras that captured every fleeting expression. She endured it all with a calm resolve. She wasn't marrying Ethan out of love, but she had made a promise to herself. If she was to survive in his world, she would do so with her head held high. As they exchanged vows, Ethan's sharp, calculated words were a stark contrast to Grace's genuine, unpolished delivery. While his pledge sounded rehearsed, hers carried a weight of honesty that surprised everyone, including Ethan. She looked him in the eye, not with affection, but with an unwavering strength that unsettled him. The reception was a whirlwind. Grace moved awkwardly among Ethan's elite guests, each interaction a delicate dance of politeness and silent judgment. Ethan, ever the host, kept her close, introducing her as Mrs. Blackstone, with a practiced smile that hid the growing unease in his chest. He had underestimated her impact, not just on the people around them, but on himself. Later that night, in the quiet of their penthouse, the atmosphere shifted. Gone were the lights and applause. In their place was a heavy silence. Grace, still in her wedding gown, stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows, gazing at the city below. Ethan watched her from a distance, a glass of scotch in his hand. "This isn't what I imagined my wedding night would look like," she said, her voice soft but firm. Ethan smirked, disappointed. She turned to face him, her expression unreadable. Not disappointed. Just wondering what I've gotten myself into. Ethan's smirk faded. For the first time, he saw a flicker of vulnerability in her eyes, a crack in the armor she had worn all evening. It wasn't pity she wanted, nor reassurance. It was understanding. But Ethan didn't know how to give her that. Vulnerability wasn't a language he spoke. Instead, he deflected. "You'll adapt. You're stronger than you think. Grace raised an eyebrow. And you think that's enough? Strength. It's a start. She sighed, turning back to the window. This is your game, Ethan, but I won't let it consume me. Her words lingered in the air long after she left the room. The weeks following the wedding were a trial by fire. Grace was thrust into Ethan's high-powered world, where every glance, every word, carried layers of meaning. She quickly realized that her authenticity, which Ethan had admired, was both her greatest asset and her biggest liability. Her first public appearance as Mrs. Blackstone was at a charity gala, a glittering event where socialites and executives mingled over champagne and whispered gossip. Grace, dressed in another carefully selected gown, felt like an imposter, but she refused to let it show. Ethan, ever the strategist, stayed by her side, guiding her through conversations with ease. Yet he couldn't help but notice the way Grace held her own. She didn't pander or pretend to fit in. She spoke plainly, her honesty disarming even the most skeptical attendees. The moment that cemented her place in their world came when a prominent donor made a veiled comment about her background. "You must feel overwhelmed, stepping into such a different life," the woman said, her tone dripping with condescension. Grace smiled politely. "Overwhelmed? No. Life has a way of preparing you for things you never expect. I think we're all just figuring it out as we go." The donor blinked, caught off guard by Grace's candor. Ethan, watching from a distance, felt an unfamiliar pang of pride. But the cracks in their arrangement began to show behind closed doors. Ethan's life, built on control, clashed with Grace's refusal to conform. Their arguments often started over small things, a misplaced document, a missed dinner, but quickly escalated into deeper conflicts. You can't just bulldoze your way through everything. Grace snapped one evening after a particularly heated argument about her reluctance to attend another event. "And you can't keep resisting every step of the way," Ethan countered. "This isn't just about you, Grace. It's about us." Grace laughed bitterly. "Us? There is no us. Ethan, this is a business arrangement, remember?" Her words hit harder than she intended, and the flicker of hurt in Ethan's eyes was enough to make her pause. But before she could say anything, he turned and walked away. One night, Ethan found himself drawn to the library, a quiet corner of the penthouse he rarely used. He stumbled upon an old photo album tucked away on a dusty shelf. Flipping through the pages, he saw fragments of a life he had long buried. Pictures of his mother smiling at him as a child, moments of warmth that had been overshadowed by his father's cold ambition. Grace walked in, her expression softening when she saw the album in his hands. "Is that your family?" Ethan hesitated before nodding. "My mother. She died when I was young." Grace sat beside him, her demeanor uncharacteristically gentle. What was she like? For a moment, Ethan let down his guard. He told her about the kindness she had shown him, the way she tried to shield him from his father's harshness. It was the most he had opened up since their marriage, and Grace listened intently, sensing the weight of his words. "You carry her with you," she said quietly, "in the way you push yourself, the way you protect what matters to you, but you don't have to carry it alone." Ethan looked at her, startled by the sincerity in her voice. For the first time, he saw Grace not as a pawn in his game, but as someone who understood the shadows he had been running from. Their fragile connection was tested when Vanessa re-entered the picture. She appeared at a corporate event uninvited, her presence like a dark cloud over the evening. Dressed to perfection, she approached Ethan and Grace with a calculated smile. "Congratulations on your marriage," Vanessa said, her tone dripping with insincerity. "Quite the story. Tell me, Grace, how does it feel to go from scrubbing floors to walking on red carpets?" Grace held her ground, her expression calm. "It's a reminder that life can change in unexpected ways. Sometimes, the unexpected turns out to be the best thing that ever happened to you." Vanessa's smile faltered, but she quickly recovered. Ethan always did have a taste for the unconventional. As Vanessa walked away, Grace turned to Ethan. "She's not done, you know." "I know. Ethan replied, his jaw tight. But neither are we. The cracks in their marriage were still there, but so were the beginnings of something neither of them had anticipated: understanding. Grace's resilience and Ethan's guarded vulnerability created a bond that, while fragile, was undeniable. But as they prepared to face Vanessa's next move, both knew that the past had a way of resurfacing, and the battles they had fought were only the beginning. The storm within. The days following Vanessa's uninvited reappearance were filled with tension. Her cryptic remarks and veiled threats lingered in Grace's mind like a dark cloud. Ethan, though outwardly composed, was uncharacteristically quiet, retreating to his study for hours at a time. The walls of their penthouse, once a sanctuary, now seemed like a prison holding secrets neither wanted to confront. Grace wasn't naive. She knew Vanessa wasn't finished. The woman's presence had felt too deliberate, her words too carefully chosen. Grace also knew that whatever Vanessa had planned wasn't just about Ethan's empire. It was personal. Vanessa wanted to dismantle everything Ethan and Grace were building, starting with their fragile partnership. One evening, as Grace cleaned up after dinner, Ethan entered the kitchen, his tie loosened and a drink in his hand. He leaned against the counter, watching her in silence. "You're quiet tonight," she said without looking at him. "Just thinking." About her. Ethan didn't deny it. Vanessa doesn't make empty threats. Whatever she's planning, it won't be subtle. Grace put down the dish she was scrubbing and turned to face him. "So what do we do? Wait for her to strike?" Ethan's jaw tightened. "I'm handling it." "Handling it," she repeated, her voice rising. "Ethan, this isn't just about you anymore. Whatever she does will affect both of us." Ethan sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You don't understand how she operates, Grace. She's ruthless, and she knows where to hit." "Then help me understand," Grace countered. "Stop shutting me out." For a moment, Ethan looked like he might argue, but then his shoulders slumped. "She has leverage," he admitted. "Something from my past. If she exposes it, it could ruin everything." Grace crossed her arms. "And you were just going to keep that to yourself." "I didn't want to drag you into it." Grace stepped closer, her voice softening. "Ethan, I'm already in it. Whatever this is, we face it together." Her words surprised him. He had expected resistance, even anger, but not solidarity. For a man who had spent his life guarding his vulnerabilities, the idea of leaning on someone else felt foreign and dangerous. The next day, Ethan decided to show Grace what he was up against. They drove to the outskirts of the city to a gated property that once belonged to Ethan's father. The mansion, though grand, bore the weight of abandonment. Its once pristine facade was cracked, the gardens overgrown with weeds. "This is where I grew up," Ethan said as they walked through the empty halls. "My father built his empire here. Every decision, every plan. He made it all happen in this house." Grace ran her fingers along the dusty banister. "It feels heavy." "It was," Ethan admitted. "My father was a man who believed in control above all else. Emotions were weaknesses, and mistakes were unforgivable. When my mother died, he told me it was because she wasn't strong enough to handle the pressure." Grace stopped, turning to look at him. "That's not true." "I know," Ethan said, his voice tight. "But he made me believe it. For years, I thought if I could just be perfect, I wouldn't end up like her." Grace placed a hand on his arm. "And Vanessa knows this." Ethan nodded. "She's found something. Letters my mother wrote before she died. If those letters go public, they'll paint my father as a monster and my family as a spectacle. It could destroy my name, my company, everything I've built." Grace frowned. "But it's not your fault, Ethan. Why should you carry the weight of his mistakes?" "Because in my world, perception is reality," Ethan replied. "And Vanessa knows that better than anyone." Later that evening, back at the penthouse, Grace couldn't shake the image of Ethan as a boy, trapped in a world of expectations he couldn't meet. It explained so much about him: his need for control, his fear of vulnerability. But it also made her realize how deeply Vanessa's plan could hurt him. Determined to take action, Grace reached out to Julia Harper, a senior executive in Ethan's company, and one of the few people who seemed genuinely supportive of her. Julia was sharp, pragmatic, and fiercely loyal, a rare combination in Ethan's cutthroat world. Vanessa's not just after Ethan's reputation, Grace told Julia during their meeting. She wants to break him. Julia nodded. She's playing a long game, Grace, but you have something she doesn't. What's that? Authenticity, Julia said. You're not like the rest of us. People believe in you because you're real. Use that. Grace wasn't sure how to wield authenticity as a weapon, but Julia's words stayed with her. If Vanessa wanted to exploit the past, then Grace would shine a light on it first. Grace's chance came sooner than expected. A leaked article surfaced, hinting at the existence of the letters and their damaging contents. The piece was filled with speculation and subtle jabs at Ethan's character, painting him as a man with dark family secrets. Ethan was livid. She's escalating, he said, pacing the living room. If this continues. It won't, Grace interrupted. Ethan stopped, staring at her. What do you mean? We're not going to let her control the narrative, Grace said firmly. We'll tell the truth. Ethan frowned. The truth won't save me, Grace. It'll bury me. Not if we own it, she countered. People respect honesty, Ethan. If we show them that you're not hiding, they won't have anything to attack. Ethan hesitated. The idea of exposing his vulnerabilities to the world went against everything he had been taught. But Grace's conviction was unwavering, and for the first time, he wondered if she might be right. The press conference was held the following week. Ethan and Grace stood side by side as cameras flashed and reporters shouted questions. Grace spoke first, her voice calm but firm. Before the rumors spiral out of control, we want to address them head-on, she said. Yes, there are letters from Ethan's past that paint a complicated picture of his family, but they don't define who he is today. Ethan has worked tirelessly to build a legacy of integrity and excellence, and I won't let anyone take that away from him. Ethan took the microphone, his voice steady despite the turmoil within. My family's past is not something I'm proud of, but it's a part of me. I've spent my life trying to rise above it, to create something better, and I will continue to do so, with Grace by my side. The room erupted in questions, but Ethan and Grace left without answering them. They had said what needed to be said, and for the first time, Ethan felt a sense of relief. The truth was out, and the power Vanessa had held over him was slipping away. That night, Ethan and Grace sat together on the balcony, the city lights twinkling below. For the first time, the silence between them felt comfortable. You were right, Ethan admitted. Owning the truth, it was the only way. Grace smiled. You're stronger than you think, Ethan. So are you, he said, his gaze softening. I couldn't have done this without you. Their moment of peace was brief, but it was enough to remind them of what they were fighting for. Vanessa might have started the battle, but Ethan and Grace were determined to finish it, together. A rising storm. The aftermath of the press conference was swift and chaotic. News outlets dissected every word Ethan and Grace had spoken, filling their front pages with headlines ranging from admiration to suspicion. Social media erupted into debates, some praising their courage, others calling it a calculated move to distract from deeper scandals. But for Ethan and Grace, the biggest storm was brewing out of sight. Vanessa, thwarted but not defeated, had retreated into the shadows to regroup. She wasn't the kind of woman to accept defeat lightly, and her silence was more unsettling than her attacks. The first sign of Vanessa's next move came when Ethan's company faced an unexpected audit. It wasn't unusual for large corporations to be scrutinized, but the timing felt deliberate. The auditors uncovered discrepancies in the financial records, nothing catastrophic, but enough to raise red flags. Ethan's board of directors, already uneasy after the press conference, began to murmur about his leadership. Vanessa, Ethan muttered under his breath when the news reached him. This has her fingerprints all over it. Grace, seated across from him in the penthouse's sprawling living room, frowned. "Do you think she's working with someone inside the company?" "It's possible," Ethan admitted. "She knows how to exploit weaknesses, and right now, I've given her plenty to work with." Grace leaned forward. "Then we need to shore up your defenses. Find out who's feeding her information." Ethan smirked faintly. "You sound like a strategist." "I've been paying attention," Grace replied, a hint of a smile on her lips. "And I'm not letting her win." While Ethan focused on damage control within the company, Grace took a different approach. She reached out to Julia Harper, whose insight and experience had already proven invaluable. Together, they began quietly investigating the source of the leaks that had led to the audit. Their search led them to a mid-level executive named Cameron Hayes. Cameron had been with the company for years, but his recent financial troubles had made him an easy target for manipulation. Julia managed to obtain emails linking him to Vanessa's network, but the evidence wasn't definitive enough to act on. "We can't go public with this," Julia warned, "not without risking more backlash." Grace nodded, her mind racing. "Then we need to make him come to us." Meanwhile, Ethan found himself facing growing resistance from his board. Vanessa's insinuations about his leadership had sown seeds of doubt, and several key members began openly questioning his decisions. Ethan, who had always thrived under pressure, found himself uncharacteristically rattled. One evening, after a particularly tense board meeting, Ethan returned to the penthouse to find Grace waiting for him. She was seated on the couch, a laptop in her lap, and a determined expression on her face. "I think I've figured out how we can turn this around," she said, motioning for him to sit. Ethan raised an eyebrow. "You've been busy." "Someone has to be," Grace replied. "Vanessa's playing the long game, but she's also underestimating us. She's betting on the fact that you'll react the way you always do, by controlling the narrative. But what if we change the game?" Ethan leaned back, intrigued. "I'm listening." Grace explained her plan. Rather than playing defense, they would go on the offensive. They would launch a community initiative that showcased the company's values and commitment to transparency. By involving employees at all levels and engaging directly with the public, they could rebuild trust from the ground up. Ethan was skeptical. "It sounds idealistic." "It's authentic," Grace countered. "And it's what Vanessa can't fake. If we focus on what makes this company, and you, different, we take away her power." Ethan studied her for a moment, then nodded. "Let's do it." The initiative launched within days, starting with a series of town hall meetings where employees were invited to voice their concerns and share ideas. Grace attended every session, listening intently and taking notes. Her genuine interest in their stories resonated, and soon word spread about her involvement. Ethan, initially hesitant to embrace the initiative, found himself drawn into its momentum. Watching Grace interact with employees, he saw a side of his company and himself that he had long neglected. For the first time in years, he felt a connection to the people behind the numbers and charts. But Vanessa wasn't idle. When news of the initiative reached her, she saw it as a direct challenge. She began planting rumors about Grace's involvement, suggesting that her sudden influence was part of a calculated effort to distract from Ethan's shortcomings. Anonymous articles and social media posts questioned Grace's qualifications and motives, reigniting the skepticism that had dogged her since the wedding. The attacks took a toll on Grace. Despite her resilience, the constant scrutiny and whispers began to wear her down. Ethan noticed the change in her demeanor and confronted her one evening. "You've been quiet lately," he said, sitting beside her on the balcony. Grace sighed. "It's just exhausting. No matter what I do, people assume the worst." "Welcome to my world," Ethan said with a wry smile. "But you're handling it better than I ever did." Grace looked at him, surprised by the vulnerability in his voice. "You really think that?" "I know it," Ethan replied. "You've done more for this company, and for me, than anyone else. Don't let them take that away from you." His words, though simple, gave Grace a renewed sense of determination. The turning point came when Grace and Julia managed to corner Cameron Hayes during a company event. Posing as allies, they convinced him to meet privately to discuss his involvement with Vanessa. Cameron, sensing an opportunity to negotiate, admitted to leaking information but claimed he had been coerced. "She threatened my family," he said, his voice trembling. "I didn't have a choice." Grace, though angry, kept her tone calm. "Then help us stop her. Give us everything you have." With Cameron's cooperation, they obtained a trove of evidence linking Vanessa to the financial sabotage and media leaks. It was the leverage they needed to neutralize her once and for all. Ethan and Grace made their move carefully, releasing the evidence to the media in a controlled statement that painted Vanessa as the architect of a calculated attack. The revelation stunned the public and dismantled Vanessa's credibility. Her allies within the company quickly distanced themselves, and the board rallied behind Ethan. For the first time in weeks, Ethan and Grace felt a sense of victory. But they knew better than to celebrate prematurely. Vanessa was down, but not out, and the shadows of their pasts still loomed large. As the storm settled, Ethan and Grace found themselves on a new footing. Their partnership, once a calculated arrangement, had evolved into something deeper. They were no longer adversaries or pawns in a game of revenge. They were allies, bound by shared struggles and a growing trust. But Vanessa's final play was yet to come, and the road ahead promised challenges neither could foresee. Vanessa's final move. The victory over Vanessa's schemes brought a temporary calm, but it was a fragile peace. Ethan and Grace knew Vanessa well enough to anticipate that her retreat wasn't surrender. She was regrouping, watching, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The media had shifted its narrative, now lauding Grace's resilience and Ethan's bold leadership in facing their challenges. Yet the praise felt hollow to Grace. The pressure of constantly proving herself, both to the public and within Ethan's world, was beginning to take a toll. Ethan, too, felt the strain. The battles they had fought together had forged a bond, but cracks still lingered beneath the surface. Unspoken fears, unresolved pain, and the ever-present specter of Vanessa. One crisp evening, as the city glittered below the penthouse balcony, Ethan sat in silence, nursing a glass of whiskey. Grace joined him, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea. For a while, neither spoke, the weight of unspoken thoughts hanging heavy between them. "Do you think it's over?" Grace finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan didn't look at her. "Not with Vanessa. She doesn't know how to let go." Grace sighed. "I don't know if I can keep living like this, always looking over my shoulder, waiting for the next attack." Ethan turned to her, his expression softer than usual. "You don't have to. If this is too much, I'll—" "No," Grace interrupted, her tone firm. "I'm not leaving, Ethan. But I need to know there's an end to this." Ethan reached for her hand, surprising them both. "There will be. I'll make sure of it." The following week, Vanessa resurfaced in spectacular fashion. A series of articles appeared in a major financial magazine, accusing Ethan's company of unethical practices. The claims were vague but damaging, casting doubt on his integrity and the legitimacy of his recent successes. Ethan immediately recognized Vanessa's hand in the attack. She had been quiet for too long, and this was her way of reminding him that she still held power. The board, though supportive after their last victory, was beginning to waver again. Investors were nervous, and the stock price dipped in response. "It's her final move," Ethan told Grace during a late-night strategy session. "She's betting that the damage to my reputation will be enough to force me out." Grace leaned forward, her expression determined. "Then we take the fight to her. No more reacting. We expose her for who she really is." Ethan hesitated. "You're asking me to play her game." "No," Grace corrected. "I'm asking you to end it." Grace and Julia worked tirelessly, gathering every piece of evidence they could find on Vanessa. Cameron Hayes proved invaluable, providing more details about Vanessa's operations and connections. They uncovered a tangled web of bribery, blackmail, and corruption, all orchestrated by Vanessa to maintain her influence. As they pieced together their case, Grace noticed something in the documents, a name that appeared repeatedly in Vanessa's dealings: Lucas Grayson. The man Vanessa had betrayed Ethan with was more deeply entwined in her schemes than they had realized. Ethan confronted Lucas at an industry event, his calm demeanor masking the fury simmering beneath the surface. Lucas, suave and self-assured, greeted Ethan with a mocking smile. "Ethan," Lucas drawled, swirling his drink. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" "You've been working with Vanessa," Ethan said flatly. "Feeding her information, backing her attacks." Lucas smirked. "You always were quick to jump to conclusions." Ethan stepped closer, lowering his voice. "I don't need to jump. I have the proof." Lucas's smirk faltered, but he quickly recovered. "Even if that's true, what are you going to do about it? You can't touch Vanessa. She's too smart to leave anything traceable." Ethan leaned in, his tone icy. "Maybe. But you're not untouchable. And if you don't want me to dismantle everything you've built, you'll tell me exactly what she's planning next." Lucas hesitated, the weight of Ethan's words sinking in. Finally, he sighed. "She's not stopping until you're destroyed. But there's something bigger at play. Vanessa's not just after you. She's after Grace." Ethan's blood ran cold. "What do you mean?" "She's digging into Grace's past," Lucas said. "Something about her family. I don't know the details, but whatever it is, Vanessa thinks it's enough to ruin her." Ethan returned home, his mind racing. He found Grace in the living room, poring over more documents with Julia. The sight of her, so focused and determined, filled him with a mix of admiration and fear. He had promised to protect her, but Vanessa was targeting the one part of Grace's life she had worked so hard to shield. "We need to talk," Ethan said, his tone serious. Julia excused herself, leaving them alone. Grace looked up, concern etched on her face. "What's wrong?" "Vanessa's going after you," Ethan said. "She's digging into your past." Grace's face paled, but she quickly composed herself. "She won't find anything." Ethan hesitated. "Grace, if there's something she can use, anything, you need to tell me. I can't protect you if I don't know what we're up against." Grace looked away, her hands trembling slightly. "There's nothing," she said quietly, but Ethan could see the fear in her eyes. The next day, Vanessa made her move. A scandalous article appeared, detailing Grace's childhood struggles and her estranged relationship with her brother Daniel. The piece painted Grace as a manipulative opportunist, implying that she had used Ethan's wealth and influence to escape her past. Grace was devastated. The article dredged up painful memories she had spent years trying to forget. Daniel, once a bright and hopeful young man, had fallen into a life of crime and addiction. Grace had cut ties with him to protect herself, but the decision had haunted her ever since. Ethan found her sitting on the balcony, tears streaming down her face. He sat beside her, unsure of what to say. "She's turned my life into a weapon," Grace whispered. "Everything I've worked for, everything I've tried to leave behind. It's all out there now." Ethan reached for her hand. "We'll fight this. Together." Grace looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and gratitude. "You can't fix this, Ethan. It's my fight." "Then let me stand with you," he said softly. "You've stood by me through everything. Let me do the same for you." Ethan and Grace held another press conference, addressing the revelations head-on. Grace, with Ethan by her side, spoke candidly about her past, her struggles, and her choices. Her vulnerability struck a chord with the public, and support began pouring in from unexpected places. Vanessa, meanwhile, found herself on the defensive. Ethan and Grace's united front had neutralized her attack, and the evidence they had gathered against her was starting to surface. Julia and Cameron worked behind the scenes to ensure that Vanessa's network unraveled piece by piece. The final blow came when Ethan, using the leverage he had gained, forced Vanessa into a corner. With no allies left and her reputation in tatters, she had no choice but to retreat. Ethan and Grace had won the battle, but not without scars. That night, as the city skyline glittered in the distance, Ethan and Grace sat together in silence, the weight of their journey settling over them. They had faced betrayal, scandal, and pain, but they had emerged stronger, both as individuals and as a team. "This isn't how I imagined my life would turn out," Grace said quietly. Ethan smiled faintly. "Neither did I, but I wouldn't change it." Grace leaned her head on his shoulder, a sense of peace washing over her for the first time in months. The storm had passed, but the journey was far from over. Together, they would face whatever came next. A new horizon. The storm that had consumed Ethan and Grace's lives finally began to recede. Vanessa's schemes had crumbled under the weight of their resilience and unity, leaving her with little choice but to retreat into obscurity. The media, once relentless in its scrutiny, shifted its focus to new scandals and stories, leaving the couple a chance to rebuild their lives away from the glaring spotlight. But the scars of their battle lingered. Ethan and Grace knew that their lives had been irrevocably changed by the events of the past months. Their marriage, born from calculation and necessity, had evolved into something deeper, but it was still fragile, built on a foundation of unspoken truths and unresolved pain. The morning after Vanessa's final retreat, Grace stood on the balcony, sipping coffee as the first rays of sunlight illuminated the city below. Ethan joined her, his footsteps soft on the polished floor. "Thinking about the future?" he asked, leaning against the railing beside her. Grace smiled faintly. "Something like that. For the first time in a long time, I feel like I can breathe." Ethan nodded, his gaze distant. "We've come a long way." Grace turned to him, her expression serious. "But we still have a long way to go." Ethan met her eyes, understanding the weight of her words. Their journey was far from over, and both knew that the next steps would define not only their marriage but their individual paths. A letter from the past. Later that day, as Grace sorted through a box of her belongings that had been delivered from her old apartment, she came across a sealed envelope. Her heart skipped a beat as she recognized the handwriting. It was from her estranged brother Daniel. She hesitated before opening it, unsure of what she would find. The letter, dated years earlier, was a plea for forgiveness. Daniel had written about his regrets, his struggles, and his desire to make amends. He had spoken of his hope that one day they could find their way back to each other. Tears welled in Grace's eyes as she read his words. She had spent so long running from her past, trying to bury the pain of their fractured relationship, that she hadn't considered the possibility of reconciliation. The letter was a stark reminder that while she couldn't change the past, she could choose how to face it. When Ethan returned home that evening, he found Grace sitting at the dining table, the letter spread out in front of her. She looked up at him, her expression a mix of hope and uncertainty. "I need to find him," she said simply. Ethan nodded, his support unwavering. "Then we will." A journey of forgiveness. Tracking Daniel down wasn't easy. His last known address was outdated, and his social media accounts were inactive. Grace and Ethan enlisted the help of Julia, who used her extensive network to uncover his whereabouts. After weeks of searching, they finally located him in a small town several hours away. Grace was nervous as they drove to meet him. Ethan, sensing her apprehension, reached over and took her hand. "Whatever happens, you're not doing this alone." They arrived at a modest community center, where Daniel worked as a counselor for recovering addicts. Grace watched him from a distance, her heart pounding as she took in the sight of the brother she hadn't seen in years. He looked older, his face lined with the struggles he had endured, but there was a calmness about him that Grace didn't recognize. When Daniel spotted her, his eyes widened in shock. He approached cautiously, his expression a mixture of disbelief and hope. "Grace," he said softly, "is it really you?" She nodded, tears streaming down her face. "It's me, Daniel." The siblings embraced, the weight of their shared pain lifting as they held each other. For the first time in years, Grace felt a sense of closure she hadn't thought possible. Building a new legacy. Reuniting with Daniel marked a turning point for Grace. She began to see her past not as a burden, but as a source of strength. Her experiences had shaped her into the person she was, and she realized that her resilience was something to be proud of. Ethan, inspired by Grace's journey, began to confront his own past. He returned to his childhood home, sifting through the remnants of his mother's life and finding solace in the memories he had long suppressed. He even began to reach out to his estranged family members, seeking to rebuild the connections he had neglected in his pursuit of perfection. Their personal growth extended to their professional lives as well. Grace, with Ethan's encouragement, launched a community initiative focused on providing support and resources to individuals like her brother, those who had struggled with addiction and needed a second chance. The program quickly gained traction, becoming a cornerstone of Ethan's company's philanthropic efforts. Ethan, for his part, found a renewed sense of purpose in his work. He began to shift his focus from expansion and profit to sustainability and impact, ensuring that his empire left a positive legacy. His leadership style softened, and he became more approachable, earning the respect of his employees in ways he never had before. A new beginning. Months later, as they stood on the balcony of their penthouse, watching the city come alive below them, Ethan and Grace reflected on their journey. Their marriage, once a carefully constructed arrangement, had become something real, something neither of them had expected, but both had come to cherish. "We've come a long way," Ethan said, his arm around Grace's shoulders. Grace smiled, leaning into him. "And we're just getting started." Ethan turned to her, his gaze filled with a warmth she had never seen before. "Whatever comes next, we'll face it together." Grace nodded, her heart full. For the first time in her life, she felt truly seen, truly valued. And as they stood there, united against whatever the future might hold, she knew that they had found something rare and beautiful, a partnership built not on perfection, but on resilience, trust, and love.